Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dorothy O'Byrne here from the CCMA. Delighted to see so many of you joining us this afternoon. And as usual, we're going to give a couple of minutes just for everybody to log in. We're expecting a big audience this afternoon. Delighted to say that. As usual, you'll see on screen Niamh O'Doherty from WSI, who supports us on all of these webinars. Hi, Niamh, and also delighted, obviously, to welcome Dr. Nicola Millard, who is our presenter today. And delighted to, that BT are sponsoring this webinar. It's a series of 2 webinars. We'll have a follow-up in 2 weeks' time that I'll give you the details for later in this call. But today we're going to be talking about the Autonomous Customer 2020. And this is a piece of research that obviously Nicola is going to share more detail on. It's a paper that was published just in February, so relatively hot off the press as COVID timing allowed. And there is a very detailed paper that will be available afterwards. So anybody who wants that paper, either drop myself or Nicola an email and we'll happily share it with you. We'll also put it up on our events page as well. But this is a series of research that's been going on, I think, over 10 years. It's the 5th iteration of the survey, and obviously providing very valuable data on the customer, and for all of us in the customer service industry, I think very valuable insights on what customers are looking for, the impact of digital technology, and where the future is going in terms of customer and customer support and customer experience. As always, we're recording the webinar, so the recording will be available later this afternoon to share with colleagues who may not have been able to join us. And also we want to make it as interactive as possible. So please do put any questions you have in the little chat box to the side. And I'll put them to Nicola at the appropriate moment. If it may be at the end, or if it's a burning question, I can certainly put it to her during the webinar. So I'm going to hand over to Nicola now. Thanks as always, Nicola, and thanks obviously to Emma and all of the team of BT who've been involved in setting up today's webinar. And I'll hand over to you. Thanks, Nicola.
Thank you, Dorothy. So hello, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola. I work for BT, but I actually work in BT's innovation team. So we're not very good in BT about telling people that we do innovation. So part of my job definitely is to say, hey, we do innovation in BT. In fact, we're a very big investor in both research and innovation. Actually, the 3rd largest in the UK, behind a couple of pharmaceutical companies. So I'm normally based at a lovely place called Adastral Park, which is in Ipswich in the east of England. And I'm currently, of course, not at Adastral Park. I'm actually in my kitchen. So Adastral Park is about 7 miles that way. But Adastral is sort of the, I guess, the hub of BT's research and innovation organisation, but it's only part of it, and it's a very global organisation, our innovation organisation. So, and it spans multiple partners as well. So I spend a lot of my time, particularly at the moment, I have to say, talking to the guys at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Cambridge University, as well as, engaging with startups and sort of figuring out what's going on in the area and how actually we respond to some of the trends that we see in the market. And I'm going to talk about some of those trends and how we connect the trends in innovation as we go through the presentation. But I guess for those of you who don't know me, I've worked in the contact center industry for maybe more years than I would care to admit. My PhD was actually on contact centers as well. So they are, it's a topic I love, but I'm also not a technologist. So my role in the innovation team is a slightly weird one, because obviously BT is a technology company and, there's a lot of techies around me, but I'm a psychologist by background. And actually, it makes a lot of sense, particularly in the context of contact centers, that a psychologist should be involved, because we are inherently a people business. So my job really is to try and understand the human components of customer experience. So firstly, what are customers themselves thinking? And that's what I'm going to present today. And then obviously on the other side, we've got our valiant agents, our advisors, who are human too, and actually add the benefits of a human brain and empathy and caring and all of the things that the machines cannot do. So how do we actually make sure that they work better? I'm not going to talk so much about that, but that's certainly a focus of a lot of the research that I do and innovation that I do. So as Dorothy said, the context of this talk is this lovely thing called the autonomous customer. And the autonomous customer we've been doing for a very long time. I know I particularly have come across and worked with you, Dorothy, on a number of occasions around usually BT Young Scientists actually presenting some of this data. But we've been doing, it's actually our 10th anniversary of doing this research this year, and we typically do it every other year. And we started back in 2010 rather modestly with just 2 countries around the world, just the UK and the US, and then gradually every other year we've got more and more ambitious. And this year it's a bumper year. It's 12 countries around the world. I did say, I apologize, just before the webinar started, that Ireland is not one of the countries at the moment, and don't blame me for that, but we have actually got Irish data on 1 or 2 other bits of the research that we have been doing. But this particular piece, what I'm actually going to talk about is the global average, a lot of the things that we're going to see globally. I will pull out a couple of things. I think it's interesting to reflect, because we do have 10 years worth of data. Particularly the US and the UK have been countries that we've surveyed very regularly. I'm just going to pull out a few things that maybe we got right or wrong, or some of the trends that we've seen over the past 10 years. But we'll start with the sort of overarching trends, I guess, the things that were obvious once we got the data, the things that really kind of stood out to us. And I think there's good news and there's bad news, I think, on the overarching trends. The first thing is that customer experience is still incredibly relevant to customers. They will punish companies that don't deliver good customer experiences. For those of you who've seen me talk before, you know that I've also been obsessing about not just the concept of satisfaction, but easy, effort. All of those things are very, very relevant to customer experience and customer experience design. So we've got, more customers, or 3 in 4 customers saying that I will buy more if you make it easier for me to do it. And that's why a lot of our connection into innovation, particularly my guiding principle for innovation, is that if we put any innovation into customer experience or the contact center, we need to think firstly, does this make things easier for customers? Because frankly, if it doesn't, they're probably not going to use it, and therefore you probably shouldn't start thinking about it as an innovation. So that's absolutely one of the core things. Obviously, I've talked a lot in the past around, how do you measure things like effort? And obviously the Net Easy score is still something we use in BT to try and drive some of this stuff. So actually measuring whether customers are finding things easy or not. Obviously, customer effort scores do a very similar job. I keep saying I don't care which score you use, just use it to think about, is this going to make lives easier for customers? Because there is a very distinct linkage into loyalty. So that's the good news. I think when we reflect on what's happened with the coronavirus, which obviously we delivered this just before coronavirus hit, I think that's one of the trends that has very much been magnified by coronavirus. I don't think people have particularly dropped their expectation of customer experience at all. In fact, I think with some of the difficulties, particularly around the grocery retailers trying to get slots for shopping and trying to get weird things that they're substituting into your baskets, that's actually eroded some of the goodwill on customer experience. And we have also seen potentially localized suppliers who are delivering a much more friction-free, easy experience actually jumping in and filling the gap where some of the companies have failed. So I think that's an interesting one that's been magnified by the pandemic. Now, the other interesting thing that's been magnified by the pandemic is people pushing people into digital experiences, and obviously that started before pandemic as well. The bad news here is only 21% of our global customers thought that digital customer experiences were excellent. And that's not very good, really. And what that trend is causing is a number of waves on some of the other trends that we're seeing, and explains quite a number of the other slightly weird trends, which I'm going to talk about in a second, are being driven by that dissatisfaction by some of the digital channels. So that's the overall picture. When we look at things like Omnichannel and how people are using channels differently, this is a graph. I apologize, I like graphs. This is a particularly fascinating graph. Now, this is UK data. And what I've done here is broken channel choices down over the past 5 iterations of the research. So we can actually see the evolution of customers' expectations of channels and their channel choices in terms of what channels do they want to interact with companies when they have a problem. And what we can start to see is a lot of the traditional channels that were declining, so the phone, email, those were on sort of, a downward trajectory on the graph until last year, until this iteration of the research, where we're suddenly seeing a massive spike in the phone as a choice. Now, there are a number of reasons for this, but principally it's because the digital channels are failing. And actually what we're starting to see is the phone is becoming that escalation point when the digital channels fail. Now, we were already getting some interesting trends around people were typically calling less, but when they did call, they were calling about more complex stuff as well. And that hasn't gone away either. But the phone is the winner. And to be honest, there's always something that surprises me in research. And that was my big surprise about the extent to which the phone went up. So we can't forget the traditional channels. I think in the previous iteration of the research 2 years ago, web chat was what was the big growth channel. We're not seeing the same growth. To be honest, it was 20% growth globally in terms of preference. That's gone down. I'll explain a little bit why in a minute, but I think, again, it's because that digital chat experience hasn't necessarily fulfilled the expectation. And then we've got other things, social media I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth. That's also on a downward trajectory. In fact, the only one that's really on a sort of consistent upward trajectory are things like apps. And that's a fairly obvious one because it's driven by smartphones. So we've got an interesting landscape, I think, in terms of that omni-channel. I would also comment that the more channels you put in, it's not a substitution. It's basically the more channels you put in, the more channels customers use. So it's not that I put email in and no one, or I put web chat in and no one emails me. It's that they may well email and try and web chat with you and phone you. So I keep saying, in terms of channel strategies, we need to think really carefully, because the more channels we add, the more complex our lives get as organizations. What are the channels that actually do fit the customer needs? And then make sure you invest in those channels. But the phone is not a new channel, it's not a sexy channel, but it is a channel that is coming out very strongly. Despite the fact that quite a number of people at conferences I've been to have said the phone is dead. And they say the phone is dead principally for one reason, that younger people don't use it. Millennials don't use the phone. So this data completely counters that. In fact, when we look at the maximal usage of the phone, it's the millennials that are calling the contact center more than any of the other generations. Now, I have to say I'm not convinced by generational research generally, but that's quite interesting in that millennials, who are typically digital first, are probably trying digital first and then not necessarily getting what they need, and the phone is their escalation channel. Whereas older users typically probably won't necessarily be digital first, they'll just lift the phone up. But we are getting evidence that that complexity is still coming onto the phone channel, and obviously that does have a huge knock-on effect to agents. And a lot of people think that the stats that around putting people on hold and not knowing what's on your website is a problem with the agents. It's not necessarily a problem with the agent. It's symptomatic of the fact that the agents are having a far harder job to do, and that we need to make sure that we train them well, and actually give them the knowledge management information, just basically stuff that they can use to talk to customers. So we need to up their knowledge, and we can't continuously train them. So that's really important as to how advisors actually get the knowledge that they talk to customers about, because the phone is not going away. In fact, the phone is your priority for expert advisors. Now, I mentioned messaging, and that absolutely was the big growth channel in the previous iteration of the research. It hasn't seen such convincing growth, mainly because I think particularly synchronous messaging, and I'm talking about things like web chat here, isn't necessarily delivering on the digital experience. Now, I moved into this house about a year ago, actually, and I had the experience on chat that wasn't so good. I was talking to various companies because obviously when you're moving, you're busy, and I had lots of chat sessions open, and it did rely on agents actually answering the chats and not timing out. And it was very evident that agents were on more than one session. So you get a very stuttering conversation. Some of those conversations got cut off mid-conversation. It was a nightmare. And of course, inevitably, I ended up 9 times out of 10 picking up the phone. So synchronous, I think, is a problem. Asynchronous, however, we're still seeing growth, and that can range from traditional channels like email, which is an asynchronous channel. In other words, you're not having a conversation, you are messaging there and back. We're also seeing a fair amount of demand for things like WhatsApp. Again, a tool that we use in our personal lives, leaking in to I want to actually deal with corporates over WhatsApp. And again, that's a good example of asynchronous messaging. Now, I think when we look at the landscape of what customers think about messaging, it's all positive. You know, they like it, it's convenient, it can be easy if it's designed well. It's a channel that they are positive about. So I think there's still growth in that channel, but we do need to think about how we make that digital experience, particularly if we're going synchronous. How do we make that experience better? And with asynchronous, it's an absolute nightmare to schedule into the contact center. So again, how do we actually start to manage that well? But of course, when we start with chat, we inevitably end up talking about chatbots. And being part of an innovation team, AI and chatbots are very much part of the conversation that I frequently am in. And I guess I've probably done about 13 chatbot projects now with all sorts of people, ranging from banks to insurance companies to local government. And again, this is a really good example of where the expectation was very high. You might have noticed that bots are a bit hyped at the moment. In fact, the 2 years ago when they were at the peak of their hype cycle, 73% of customers said that they thought that bots were going to significantly improve the customer experience. That has noticeably gone down to 58% now. And I think that's, again, symptomatic of the fact that most of us has probably encountered a bot now and tried to have a conversation with it. And actually, some of those conversations have got very frustrating. A, because the bots are not great conversationalists. B, because it's often disconnected from the contact center experience. So in other words, you have a conversation with the bot hits a dead end, you then have to start again on another channel. And that's why in the innovation space, what we've tried to do is to say we cannot separate the bot conversation from the human. Actually, we need to integrate the two so that when the bot does fail, we try and see if we can steer it. So figure out what the conversation is about and then steer it to the right advisor who might actually have the answer to the question, but also port the session across so that the advisor can see the conversation. So I think we've learned a lot with bots. There are good bots out there, don't get me wrong. My personal favorite for a long time has been the bot that Lidl, the supermarket, deployed around wine. So Margot the wine bot, which is not a particularly sophisticated bot. It just does food wine combinations. So you can ask it what goes well with fish and chips. It's apparently champagne. So that's just increased the cost of my Friday fish supper now. But you know, then of course Lidl can upsell champagne, but you can't have a conversation about anything other than food wine combinations with Margot. So Margot is an ideal example of a bot. So we've learned a lot over the past few years around deploying bots. Firstly, you know, they're not great conversationalists. They don't work by magic, they work by data. That means you need data, and data in enterprises is often messy. So where do we get that data from in order to train the bots? I have worked on a couple of projects, well, one in particular around complaints. Any of you who deal with complaints will know that firstly, they're quite long. And that's a problem because the AI does not recognize the complexity and ambiguity and sheer redundancy of human language. So we need to be able to parse those very long complaints and strip out all of the irrelevant bits, and then add to the problem something that both I have to say the British and the Irish are very good at is sarcasm when complaining. So and that's completely bypasses an algorithm. So just a few examples there, thanks to a particular train operating company who will remain nameless for my free sauna this morning. Now, the algorithm thought that was brilliant. We know it's not, because we've been on a train and we've been in a sauna, and we know that gluing the two together are not pleasant. A bot has done neither of those things, and I would need to teach it that that's sarcasm. And again, that's around training data. And why would I train it to do things like that. And then context is a problem. So whether it's emotional context, although we can look at the language that people are using, if they're swearing, it's probably, well, I don't know, it could be positive, it might not be. So it's more likely to probably be negative. So we can kind of gauge some of that. But again, algorithms are not very good at guessing it. We're much better. And as I said, don't divorce it from the human, because frankly, humans are a lot better than machines on doing a lot of this. So in terms of the landscape for the future, I'm not going to go into this in any great detail, but since this is the CCMA, we have been doing quite a lot of work around what agents of the future are likely to be doing in a world where there might well be a lot more automation on the front end. And we're already seeing a lot of these patterns, the complexity that's coming in, the fact that this is augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. So a lot of the expertise around problem solving, negotiating, technical knowledge, all of that kind of stuff, humans are better at doing than machines. So how do we make sure that our agents, our networked experts, as we like to call it, are both involved with the development of the bots and training the bots, but also add the value of the human brain once the customer does actually come through to the contact center, which is good news, I think, for the contact center, to be honest. Now, there are some things that we kind of didn't get so right. There are channels that aren't necessarily growing as fast as we maybe thought they might. Video is an interesting one, particularly at the moment, because I think video, I was in BT's video team about 15 years ago, and it was always the next big thing. And it's disappointed us, I guess, for the past 15 years until now. And actually, this is one thing that the pandemic has fundamentally changed. I always say when you've become a verb, you know you've arrived. So the guys at Zoom, bless them, they're keeping us going with our home house parties and virtual pubs. Does that translate to talking to companies though? And that's the interesting thing, because largely the answer is no. And we've done a lot on video over the years. And I think where it's growing is it tends to be areas where there's trust required, where it would be nice to look people in the eye. But at the moment we can't. And I think this is forcing a lot of very creative solutioning in the video area. So we've been doing a lot on healthcare, for example, where we'd had a lot of pushback from healthcare professionals going, no, we need to be with the patient. Now they actually don't really want to be with the patients. So we've seen massive growth in that area. We had seen a fair amount of growth in financial services around financial advice, whether it be mortgage advice or loans. But actually in BT, one of the things that we started prior to the pandemic was actually using innovation to help our engineers to do more things virtually. This is something we've deployed across our consumer centres in the UK. It's called Sitecore. And effectively what it allows us to do is rather than sending an engineer out, what we can initially do is to send a link to the customer, which will enable us, with the customer's permission, to take control of the smartphone camera and actually the light on the smartphone as well. And what we do is we talk customers through, can you show me what you've got plugged in? We can do an AI overlay on this as well. So there's standard wires and standard ports. So what we can do is to start to use augmented reality to label the wires and the ports to help both the customer, but also the advisor on the other end, to make sure that we plug the right things in. Now, prior to pandemic, this had saved us a lot of money, and actually customers liked it because we solved their problem. And we found there was one lady that was complaining about her BT TV actually, and we actually found out she was using the wrong remote control, which, had we sent an engineer out, would have been costly for both her and us. We actually just said, yeah, you're using the wrong remote control. That's not the one you should be using. We all have too many, let's face it. But obviously during the pandemic, it's desirable not to have an engineer in the house. So again, this has given us a lot of scope to actually do a lot more remote diagnostics in the contact center to actually help us not to send an engineer out and obviously get the customer fixed. So I think video has its niches, but the other one that you will have noticed on the original graph I showed, that social media is going down. Now this is in a service context. Social media actually is growing in terms of things like brand recognition and sales, but when we look specifically at service, it's not necessarily a big growth channel. And again, there was a lot of hype about social media, wasn't there? Probably again 2 iterations, so maybe 4 years ago that hype started and was shown in the data. But actually, it's a channel of last resort, we find, with customers. It will entirely depend what sector you are in as to how exposed you are in terms of social media and customers coming to you for service. So certainly if you're a retailer or a travel company, whether it be planes, trains or automobiles, probably it's a very relevant channel for you. Less so for utilities, telecoms, and certainly government is an interesting one. But it does tend to be a channel of last resort when all of the other channels have failed. It's also, I call it a channel shift channel. So typically on social media, if someone is complaining, you usually have to pull them off social media, which is a public channel, onto a private channel. And whether that channel is chats or email or the phone, that's up to you. But it is effectively shifting the customer off that very public channel, which is desirable because I need to find out who Fuzzy Duck 365 is. I don't really want to discuss things like financial or account details on Twitter with a customer. It does happen sometimes, but it's not desirable. And certainly if you're a regulated industry like banking, that's a very big no-no. So it makes life more complicated. And I think also as a comment, often it's a problem with the silos internally. So often the social media team are not necessarily the same team that are doing chat or the phone. And because customers use all three, actually having them completely disconnected with each other and giving potentially different answers to the same customer, the same question, is not necessarily a good thing. But that's actually more an organizational problem than a technology one. I'm not going to dwell on this particular trend too much, but just to say that customers are still quite worried about their data. And that's, again, symptomatic of the fact that you get a lot of stories around hacking. Obviously, things like GDPR has brought this very much to the fore of people's thinking. But I always say, you know, the easy trend and the secure trend often are opposite ends of a spectrum, because the more secure we make something, the less easy it is. So none of us can probably remember the 300,000 different passwords that we have. So, I mean, in the innovation space, a lot of the talk has now come, finally, I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time, down to things like biometrics. So whether my voice is my password, my face is my password, potentially any body part is my password for ID and V. Can I start to do it a lot more easily than having to remember passwords, which makes it hopefully both easy and secure. But I'm going to end with a trend that I think is the most fascinating one. And this trend does bring in AI, and it does bring in data. And this is all about proactivity. Now, this is about using data better. I call it a me economy. So in other words, customers are willing to share their data if they get something back for it. And again, GDPR has created that interesting conversation around what data do we actually need from customers, and how do we get them to consent to giving us the data? Now that's important because we're getting a lot more data from a lot more devices as well. So as we go into a smart future where we've got the Internet of Things and diagnostics going on in edge technology, actually we can start to become, firstly, more personalized with the customer. Now, we know personalized customer experiences are popular. Amazon and Netflix have been doing it for a very long time, and we're comfortable around that personalization piece generally. I give you my data, you personalize the experience to me. Once you've done that, you can start to become proactive. So you can start to tell customers things that they need to know before they need to tell you. So this is actually managing demand outwards rather than managing demand into your contact center. So you can start to push stuff out. And actually understanding, firstly, what are customers wanting to know about? That's a very key thing. So things like appointments or account fraud are probably things they want to know about. They don't want to know about everything, because that then becomes annoying, and then they probably will withdraw consent for their data. So that's the first thing. What channel are they likely to respond on? So that, again, that's learning what customer channel preferences are. And then there's a timely aspect to this. So yeah, it's got to be timely, the message as well. So we've been working in the innovation space. This is a company that I sit on the AI board for, called Contact Engine, that we've been, again, using in BT in our enterprise organization, which is our B2B organization. It's actually the organization I sit in. We've been using that for proactive contact around things like fault reports, so engineering visits, just using a little bit of push technology to push out on the right channel, the right message at the right time. And then there's a bot behind this that can basically take questions, shift appointments. If it becomes too complex, yes, we'll drop it down into the contact center. But it's around using data well, and using data to become a lot more proactive with customers. But of course, personalized and proactive, if we really kick the algorithms in, we can also start to become predictive. So starting to figure out things that customers want before customers know they want it. Now, the problem with this one is it can get creepy, and certainly retailers have crossed the creepy line. I know Tesco have a lot of data, and actually they did tell me that they know if you're about to get divorced. But I always say, knowing that and doing something about it is very different. So you probably wouldn't use Contact Engine to push out a message saying, I'm sorry, you're getting divorced. Maybe you could be subtle and add vouchers for wine or recommendations for lawyers. I don't know, but it's got to be appropriate. And again, if it gets creepy, if it gets annoying, under GDPR, we have every right to say, no, you cannot have my data. And actually, this takes away a lot of the sophistication that we could give customers with AI and algorithms. But again, we've got to step back. Right at the beginning, I said, we've got to think as to how this makes life easier for customers, or how it creates a better customer experience. So just because the technology can do it does not necessarily mean we should. But so I think that's a really interesting trend as we go into the future. So those are the basic, top level trends I wanted to cover. We will absolutely share the slides with you, and the report is indeed available as well. But I'm going to hand back to you, Dorothy, if that's all right.
Great. Yeah, thanks a million, Nicola. That was brilliant. A couple of questions. First one, and I always confuse myself on this, the difference between asynchronous and synchronous. How can we explain that simply? Jeff has asked.
Okay, so it's easy. So it's synchronous. Basically, the good examples of synchronous communication would be the phone or chat. So both of those involve people being on both sides of the conversation. A normal conversation is synchronous. So we are having a conversation. Asynchronous, the good example would be email or indeed WhatsApp. So it's not necessarily a two-way conversation. There's probably going to be a delay between question and answer. So it's a slightly different dynamic. So yeah, okay, that's the difference.
A customer point of view, I know companies like Sky, Virgin are using messaging which is asynchronous, and I think the feedback, or certainly my understanding is the feedback is very positive from customers, because you could be in the office, I know different in the last few weeks, but spending a query at lunchtime and you can't really go back to it until maybe you're on the train home or whatever. So in that respect, you don't have to start all over again. So the record is there, and hopefully a solution can be found to whatever query you had. So in that respect, it is working for some consumers.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely it. Again, what makes my life easier? So do I need to sit on the phone, or do I need to sit watching the web chat box? The little dots. Yeah. Someone's responding. Do I need to be there, or do I just throw the question in and wait for the answer and look at my convenience? And I think that's why we are getting that distinction between synchronous works, and particularly if you're in crisis, that's why the phone works, particularly customers in crisis at the moment. I think during the beginning of the pandemic, I'm sure everyone's had this experience with their contact centers. There was a barrage of phone calls. And of course, that was also combined with a lot of contact centers having to shift their agents from office-based working to home working. So I know a lot of brands turned their phones off for a little while, and they got barraged by other messaging means. But the phone is a really good one, because it's synchronous, because it does deal with complexity, because it does deal with the sort of more emotive aspects of a call. Actually, it's a really good one for crisis situations, albeit an extreme one in this instance.
And another question, and I'm conscious some of the figures that you showed there of the study, like a lot of companies haven't actually installed or put in place web chat. And from what you're saying, are they better off not doing it? I know it's something that could be turned on and turned off, but are they better nearly skipping that as a channel if it's not working for people?
So I would say, in terms of prioritization of channels, chat is probably very high up in my channels I would be considering. Now, as I said, it's got to be deployed appropriately. So that's really around where do I put it? What products, services are actually more suited for chat? So that's the first question to ask. But I think because we do get a lot of real positive things from customers saying they like chat, it's convenient, it's digital first, and if the experience is good, they will, you know, use it. I think it is definitely one. I think the more intriguing discussion is that typically the business case for chat has been that you can, particularly on synchronous chat, you can schedule agents on multiple chat sessions. The problem with that is the more chat sessions they are on, the less convincing that customer experience is. So I think, you know, you've got to kind of say, well, how many is the maximum? And you also can't blend synchronous and asynchronous either. So it's impossible to say halfway through a phone call, I'm sorry, I've got a chat session I've got to pay attention to. So again, that's why I said that actually it's not quite so simple in terms of scheduling into the contact center. But in terms of channels, I would say that chat is one that absolutely everyone should be looking at. It's just around where they should deploy it.
And in terms of chat as a channel, are you, based on your experience, how many chats should be the benchmark for an advisor to be trying to support at the one time?
Again, it kind of depends. Okay. I did once visit a center scarily. It was actually in Asia where they had their agents on 10 simultaneous chat sessions, and you just you can't do that. I think our recommendation is generally 3 maximum, but it will also depend on the complexity of the query, and the more complex queries come in, actually the less sessions, the less simultaneous sessions your agents can deal with. So I think, you know, 3 is kind of, I guess, one of the sort of suggested benchmarks, but if you are dealing with much more complex stuff on chat, you might want to consider less. The other actual consideration is we're also seeing in the data evidence that sometimes customers get to a limit on chat and say, can I call you? And again, the trouble then is if your chat agents have not got phone access, it then means that the customer's got to shift channel and start again. Not a technology problem. Again, it could be the way that you've siloed your agent skill sets, but do be aware that we've all been there. You know, we got to that point in the chat where it's just easier to talk to you.
Yeah. And the other question that has come through is in terms of the different channels, and I think a point you made earlier in the survey that you know, you don't want that the agent moving from voice to messaging to chat or whatever. What you're saying there, haven't seen the record, and the customer doesn't want to be repeating themselves. But sometimes contact centers are using different systems that don't talk to each other, that information isn't available. So I presume that's a big no, if possible, that it should be the same platform that's supporting all of these channels.
I mean, ideally, everything should be on the same platform and integrated, but of course, in the real world, that's far from the case. And you know, the complexity of agents' desktops can get, you know, quite intriguing around flicking around maybe 6 or 7 different systems. Ideally, I mean, we try and say, you know, don't increase the complexity, particularly with agents. I've done a lot of work on something called cognitive load, which is very high in most agent situations, because not only are they trying to manage a conversation, they're also trying to navigate through maybe 5, 6 different systems, all of whom work in different ways, and they've got to remember how to navigate through them. That's an enormous amount of cognitive load, which is why it's quite an exhausting job at times. So ideally, you know, it's around how do you use the same system for all the channels, and or at least integrate a lot of things together. The chatbot example was a classic one around you actually want a chatbot that can send information to the agent rather than a chatbot that just goes, sorry, I can't do any more. You're going to have to, you know, contact and start again. So yeah.
And I know we've obviously some of the BT team on the webinar, so I know you guys be more than happy to help anybody. This is a sponsored webinar, so you'd be more than happy to help anybody who's further information on that. And the last question from Susan, I'm just conscious of time. So Susan has asked, was there any indication that people would be happy to pay explicitly for better service and access to support?
Well, that's been one we've been debating for years, because some industries find that a lot easier than others. So airlines being the obvious one, because you very explicitly in an airline put you get what you buy, really, don't you? And they're quite brazen about it around first class, business class, and economy class, although, you know, with the current interesting developments around social distancing on planes, it's going to be intriguing to see what happens with that. But so I think certain industries have evolved, you know, with that as their natural business model. I think other industries struggle a little bit. I mean, retailers, I mean, obviously you choose a brand maybe that's kind of a prestige brand, but it's quite difficult to say, hey, I'm going to give you one level of service and you another, even though you're buying the same thing. So I think it does depend on industry, and I think it also depends on whether you can absolutely differentiate the product proposition based on that. So I think if customers are going to be paying more, they've got to be absolutely convinced that they're going to get more value for money if you're going to charge them a little bit more. And again, the airlines have done that quite well, because there's a very, very big distinction between first class, business class and economy. So they've managed to articulate that proposition. But in areas particularly like utilities and telecoms, where a lot of it's kind of intangible, we've got to work a lot harder around, well, this is actually what you will get in terms of the levels of service over and above what you've done, and this is why it's a good value for money proposition for you. And then of course you've got to deliver on that proposition as well. So
yeah that's the challenge. Yeah, no, I'm conscious that a lot of companies have the sort of the VIP rewards program that you sort of are opted into, but it isn't necessarily, you know, everybody's getting the same benefits. And in financial services, sometimes the higher value clients, they obviously deal with them differently through a premier type section. But yeah, but obviously in that case, you're not paying for that additional service. You've just been recognized as a high value customer. So it all really does go back to data.
Yeah, everything is about data.
Customer. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much, Nicola. That was superb. I really enjoyed it, and I think it explained very simply some of the concepts out there in the digital world. And just want to let everybody know that we are back again in 2 weeks' time. I'm just pulling up the name of the webinar. Reshaping the future of work: how global disruption, Dolly, Dilbert and droids are all reshaping the digital workplace. So I know that'll be yet another intriguing presentation. We look forward to that. So that's this day, 2 weeks, just to remind everybody. And just on a housekeeping, we have our Ask the Expert session this Friday, and we're delighted that we have Chris Paul, who's the CEO of Avant Card in Ireland, the credit card company based in Carrick-on-Shannon. And Chris will be joining us on Friday, so that's at 11 o'clock, just to let everybody know. And there's a lot of thank yous coming in. John, Susan, Jeff, all saying thank you so much, Nicola. So I know I've already got a query about a copy of the slides, so we will make them available, and we will have the recording of the webinar available too. And thank you, Nicola, thanks, Niamh, and thanks to Emma and all the team in BT for facilitating this webinar this afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, bye-bye.